Okay, you're live.
Hello, this is, I'm Rich Westman, and we are going to resume testimony in Senate Transportation Committee, and we're going to do things, something a little out of order. Lori Smith is on, and she's from South Burlington, and we just put, oh, excuse me, sir.
So,
Okay.
You did the same
Yeah.
earlier
Yes, with Jamie.
with Jamie, which we're gonna take some quick testimony before we get to our other testimony from you about S66.
Well, good morning and thank you for hearing from me. I'm sorry I couldn't be here earlier. I'm Lori Smith and I am a city councilor in the city of South Burlington, and I'm speaking today as an individual, but as an individual with the perspective of a city councilor, and I've gotten a lot of feedback on this issue from residents in our area. This bill is important to our city because regulation of these noises, the noises from Jake brakes, motorcycles, modified sports cars, all of which are as loud or louder than our emergency vehicle noises, are something we have very little ability to regulate, control, or enforce. And if we have a law that requires our vehicles to have mufflers that avoid these sounds, that would get rid of a big problem that we have in our city, which is evenings, late at night, motorcycles screaming down the streets. We have rallies where sports cars get together and they rev their engines, and calls are made into law enforcement. By the time they show up, the people are gone. This is an intermittent issue. It's one that is quite frequent, particularly in the spring and summer months. Jake brakes are a constant issue, and they can be muffled and they should be muffled. And for our citizens, having these disruptive noises occur and knowing that by the time I make a call, enforcement isn't going to be able to do anything, it's a very frustrating situation. It's one that does not need to be occurring, and legislation that makes it so that our inspection system takes care of the majority of these issues seems like a no-brainer for the communities that are impacted by this.
Any questions for Mr. Smith?
No, but thank you for,
No.
yeah.
Thank you
Well,
very
thank you very much, and I hope that this bill can progress through the system and that we can get some relief.
And we are now going to move on to the overview of the report on excessive motor vehicle noise from the Agency of Transportation. And I think the first person on our list is David Jones.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Good morning. My name is David Jones. I'm with SLR Consulting. I'm the U.S. manager of SLR's acoustics team. I lead a team of about 20 people who do a wide range of acoustical consulting services for a wide range of clients. I have about 25 years of experience doing thousands and thousands of sound level measurements, interpreting those measurements, and helping my clients solve noise and sound problems. SLR was retained by the Agency of Transportation to help them pull this report together. And I am happy to come in this morning and talk about the main points in the report. The report's pretty extensive. It has a lot of sections, a lot of background. I'm not going to cover all of it, but I will try and touch on the high points and the parts that really were requested in the legislation that caused this report to be issued. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I did ask for some slides to get printed out. Hopefully you all have either electronic or paper copies of some of these slides. I'm going to spend probably about 20 or 30 minutes talking through the report, and then I'm going to leave some time for questions. And then there are a bunch of slides in there that are not necessarily going to be covered by my presentation, but they have some background just about acoustics and noise in general. And we can touch on those if need be. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, this will just take 1 minute. So. All right, so hopefully you all can see that intro slide there. Does that look all right?
No. We don't see it. Oh,
You
good.
do not see it, or do you see it?
No, we do not.
Oh, we might have it.
Hold on a second. Let me try that again.
Perfect.
Now, well, we see.
Oh, we see
There
that.
we go. You see you. And now do you see the slide?
Yes.
You're good to go.
All right, we're good to go. Excellent. Okay. So the this report was prepared essentially in response, as you all probably know, to Act 41 from 2023, which essentially asked the Agency of Transportation to develop a report that covered these 5 topics. And these 5 topics were, number 1, if there should be a noise standard in statute or the periodic inspection manual, or both, and if so, what that standard should be. 2, the cost to incorporate noise testing into the periodic inspection manual. 3, the cost to train law enforcement officers on noise testing. 4, possible options to address excessive motor vehicle noise not involving noise testing. So those are things like visual inspections, enforcement of the state motor vehicle inspection, labeling of components of exhaust systems. And then 5, approaches to minimize excessive motor vehicle noise from other states. So that's some combination of increased enforcement by law enforcement coupled with an objective noise standard. So I'm just going to step through these 5 different charges or purposes. The study overview, kind of how we did the study. We had interviews with 5 different stakeholder agencies. We call them stakeholders in the report. So that was the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Sheriff's Association, Vermont Association of Police Chiefs, Vermont State Police, and the Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles. We didn't do extensive surveys of these agencies. We just met with designated representatives of each one for about an hour. We had a set list of questions that were essentially their experience with noise testing, noise ordinances, their feedback from their constituents, that kind of stuff. Generally to get an overview of their experience and feelings about noise testing and noise ordinances. We did research on regulations and legislation from other states surrounding Vermont and in Vermont. So existing noise ordinances in counties and cities in Vermont. And then we also reviewed a report from Parsons, who is the vendor for the automated vehicle inspection program. So that's actually the software that is used by inspection mechanics during annual inspections. So they developed a report on what it would take to integrate noise testing into the AVIP, and we reviewed that report as well. So charge number 1, and number 1 is pretty complicated. It has a lot of parts. We've broken it down into some constituent parts here to talk about it. So remember, number 1 says, if there should be a noise standard in statute or the periodic inspection manual or both, and if so, what that standard should be. So should there be a noise standard? So stakeholder opinions were varied. Again, we did not query the entire agencies, right? These were just single individuals from each agency. They expressed, they generally talked about challenges about noise ordinances or noise standards. Their concerns generally were focused on kind of 3 key areas: enforceability or repeatability of a noise standard. So they wanted something, if something were implemented, they wanted something that could be enforced clearly and did not have a large subjective element to it or an opinion-based element. Several expressed concern about reallocation of law enforcement resources. So they were concerned about, shifting law enforcement priorities from other traffic enforcement, DUI enforcement, et cetera. So they were concerned essentially about placing additional burden on law enforcement. And then there was some concern about the subjective nature of some noise ordinances. So some noise ordinances say things like excessively noisy or loud, right? So these are subjective or opinion based. And they were concerned about placing that subjective judgment on either inspection mechanics or law enforcement officers. So those were some of the challenges pointed out by stakeholders. There was some support from some stakeholders. Generally, they had anecdotal experience with loud vehicles impacting them or their neighbors. They had feedback from constituents, so they knew that there were people who were concerned and complained about loud vehicles, so they knew this was an issue. And they also pointed out they had concerns about noise as a long-term health issue, right? They understood that excessive noise was a health issue, and they felt like that could be addressed. So the report includes no specific recommendation about whether there should be a noise standard. What we tried to do was present, I should say, challenges and benefits to each of several options, and lay those out. So the second part of charge one was, what should that standard be? So should there be a noise ordinance or a noise standard? If so, what should that standard be? And it kind of broke out and pointed out two different places that a noise standard could be implemented, either in statute or in the periodic inspection manual, the PIM, or both, right? So to try and break down the myriad of potential ways to enforce a noise standard, we kind of looked at 5 options. And obviously this is not fully all inclusive, and any implementation could also be some combination of those 5 options, right? But we presented 5 options, tried to break them down into separate chunks so we could talk about them. And those 5 options were essentially adding more specific visual inspection to the Vermont Periodic Inspection Manual, the VPIM. Sound level testing by inspection mechanics through the VPIM. So this would actually be adding a sound level testing requirement to the inspection process. Sound level testing by law enforcement. So this would be either roadside measurements of stationary or moving vehicles by law enforcement officers. Sound level testing as a defense after a citation. So this is similar to what Maine does. So this would be sound level test, some combination of a subjective standard and an objective standard. And then fixed location sound level testing. So this is similar to a speed camera. So this would be something like a roadside sound level testing at a fixed location. And I'm going to go through those 5 different options, kind of lay out challenges and benefits associated with each one. So I know this is kind of small. Hopefully you'll also have that. This is also in the report. Essentially 2 of those options involve changing the periodic inspection manual. They involve sort of changing the inspection procedure in Vermont. The first is to modify or change the VPIM, so to change the inspection program to focus a little bit more on noise or sound. So currently, and I wish I had put a slide in to show what the current inspection manual says about sound, but I'll just describe it to you right now. Actually, I could drag this over. Okay, so the first, it's mentioned in 2 different sections, one for passenger cars, light trucks, and then in a second section for motorcycles. So right now, the vehicle is supposed to be a passenger vehicle, is supposed to be rejected if it has no muffler, if there are holes or leaks in the exhaust system, and then some other requirements. Okay, so nothing really specifically about the performance of the muffler, just that there has to be a muffler present. And then the customer is advised, so this is not rejected, they're just told by the inspection mechanic that this condition exists. There is a muffler cutout, or similar device that allows excessive noise. So I added that underline, right? So this is a pretty subjective wording. Obviously, just places some onus on the inspection mechanic to say this exhaust system looks like it would cause excessive noise, and then they would advise the customer, hey, your exhaust system looks like it might cause excessive noise. So there's not really any enforcement that happens there or anything like that. So that's the current VPIM for passenger vehicles. For motorcycles, the vehicle is supposed to be rejected if there are any changes, modifications, alterations, deletions, or adjustments have been made to the exhaust system that would cause any exhaust system to generate an unreasonable sound level. So that's sort of like excessive noise. It's, again, sort of a subjective element that's placed on the inspection mechanic. But in this case, for motorcycles, it is in the reject section. There is an advise owner if the exhaust system has cut out or bypassed in violation of 40 CFR 205-166. So this is the federal motorcycle exhaust. Well, it's actually the motorcycle noise, I guess, section, and it has some requirements for motorcycle exhausts. So that's the current state. So this option would be to somehow modify the VPIM, right, to clarify this, or to push those from the advise section maybe into the reject section, right? So to reject a vehicle for excessive noise. The benefits of this is that it's easy, right? It's just a change in the rule, and then you have to sort of inform inspection mechanics about the new requirements, and then some changes to the software, right? So currently the Parsons would need to modify the software a little bit to move that from advise into reject. Should be pretty straightforward. The challenges with this is we list a bunch here. I think the most important ones are that for passenger vehicles, there's no federal labeling for mufflers. So it's it's kind of subjective, or it's actually quite subjective for the inspection mechanic, right? They can tell if there's a muffler in the system, but muffler performance, right? A muffler is basically a metal can, and inside that can, there are baffles and sometimes some absorption. And so it's very difficult to tell from just an outward inspection if the muffler actually works, right? That's just a fundamental challenge. Also, especially for motorcycles, it is really easy to change an exhaust muffler on a motorcycle. It's right there on the side. It's easy to change. People who are passionate about how their motorcycle sounds can just put a passing muffler on, take it in to get inspected, come back home and swap it out. That's just an innate challenge of doing this at the inspection level.
We have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And I'm Senator White. I'm the introducer of S66. I don't know whatever the right word is, but
Right.
I had two questions. One from actually earlier in your presentation, but we didn't stop, so I'll ask you. One of the concerns that I have with the study in general is that unfortunately the stakeholders that you interviewed, and I think the process started on a bias against doing something. The bias was we would prefer not to have to implement or make a change, rather than a neutral, are we in favor or are we against the change? It felt like going into the study, at least some of the conversations I was having with folks seemed like they were not happy that they had to do the study at all, feeling pressured, and then also not really wanting the outcome of the study to be that there were recommended changes. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that and kind of what you felt the bias was going into it with the stakeholders that you listed. And then the second question I had relates to what you're talking about now, which is you said it's hard to visually see if there are changes to the muffler because it's an internal. It's not, unless you got an X-ray, you're not going to be looking at the muffler seeing through it.
Right.
The examples in S66, I wanted to ask if you could tell me if you could visually see if a muffler was gutted, a muffler had a cutout, if it had a straight pipe exhaust, or if there was a device added to the muffler. Can you visually see those things? So those would be my two questions.
Okay. All right. I'll adjust the first one. So we're an independent consultant. We were really called in to kind of pull this report together and to conduct those interviews. We had no stake in this. We really just tried to address those 5 points as clearly as we could. Our interview questions were, just very general. Now the selection of the stakeholder selection, some of that was called out in the legislation itself. Other stakeholders were suggested by AOT, so we did not select the stakeholders that were interviewed. And I honestly felt like we got feedback, on both sides. So I don't think that there was any innate bias. I hope the report doesn't come across as innately biased. I'm just trying. I've done a lot of sound level measurements in my career. I've spent a long time doing this kind of testing, and I know that it can be difficult and complicated. So I was just trying to convey the challenges, but also the benefits. Obviously, I think you understand the benefits to having an objective noise standard or a noise standard. That's why I think you've gone through this exercise. For the second,
thank you. That helps alleviate the concerns that I heard from constituents about the bias in this. You're separate from the agency. So thank you. And yeah, the second question.
Okay, so the second question, I mean, some modifications to the muffler, you can definitely tell. For instance, straight pipes. I mean, my understanding of straight pipes means that there is no muffler at all. That should be pretty obvious. Now, I don't know right now if in the inspection process, inspectors are expected to view the underside of the vehicle necessarily. Probably not, but I'm not sure about that actually. So I would have to kick that to somebody else at AOT to discuss that. If they were able to view the bottom of the vehicle, then it would be apparent if these things have been changed. But if an undercarriage inspection is not included, then obviously that would be pretty difficult. So I think that's the answer to that.
We have another question from another member.
All right.
Yeah, I was just looking at the VNP, and it does say that the procedure for the inspector is examine the complete exhaust system, paying attention to the rest of the parts. So the exhaust system already has to be examined.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. It does say that. Yeah, it does say to view the so somehow they should already be looking at it. That's a good point. Yeah.
Right, because you have on your chart here that it adds a step. But if it's just a visual inspection, then they are already visually inspected.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So certainly there are a lot of different options for visual inspection, right? Are you checking for the presence of a sticker? Are you checking for the presence of the muffler? They should already be checking for the presence of the muffler. That's already in the manual, right? That should already be done, and the vehicle should be rejected if there is no muffler present. I think the challenge is that again, it's hard to tell what's inside the muffler based on an external inspection. So a gutted muffler would look just like a regular muffler. A muffler with a cutout, my understanding is that should be, you possibly could tell, unless I guess the cutout was hidden. So that's maybe kind of a maybe situation. But definitely straight pipes should be obvious. All right. Anything else, or should I move on?
Move on.
All right. So we also looked at another possibility is in the inspection manual to add sound level testing. So in other words, to make a step of the inspection process that every vehicle gets tested, the sound levels from the exhaust get tested during the inspection process. This is obviously much more involved, but the benefits, again, are that we implement an objective standard. So we have a set sound level, we have a test procedure, a measurement at some distance from the exhaust under some conditions. So everything's very objective. All the vehicles get tested, and there's no additional burden on law enforcement. So those are some definitely benefits of this option. Some of the challenges are it would add time to the inspection procedure, all vehicles that get tested, even the not noisy ones. And there's some challenges to testing in a shop environment, right? You often have multiple bays in an inspection facility. You're testing over here for sound, over here somebody's doing something else, over here somebody's changing a tire. So it can, it can be overcome, but it's just a challenge. But also you've got to suddenly have a relatively large fleet of sound level meters that have to be purchased, calibrated, and implemented. So, and again, there's this issue of motorcycle owners, if they want to swap that exhaust, they can go get tested, they can swap it back, right? I mean, that's just kind of a innate challenge to this idea. So that's the idea of implementing noise testing. Also, there would be quite a bit more software changes needed, right? So there would more cost to changing the software, essentially to add that whole procedure to the inspection software, right? Add a whole new section, essentially.
Did you go into, because I know really nothing about this. So, but did you go into what type of equipment the inspection station would need? And did you ask any questions about physically and what, beside the software piece, what would need to be done?
Yeah, so we do talk about in the report, we talk about quite a bit about different kinds of sound level meters that would be needed or, that could be used. And we'll go into like some cost estimates for implementing this later on. So definitely that. And then your second part of your question was about, did we ask questions about I'm sorry, I lost it. What was the second part?
Yeah, just structurally, how would you do this, and what would the barriers be, and what would the cost be?
Gotcha. Right. Okay. We'll cover costs in a couple of slides. So just as an overview, how it would happen is that the software, the automated vehicle inspection program software, would be updated to have a sound level inspection component, right? So as the inspector goes through the process, right, that would kick up and say, okay, time for the sound level test. They would take a sound level meter, would need to be of a certain type of accuracy. A type 2 meter would be okay. Those are typically about $500, somewhere in that range, could be a little cheaper. And then they would take a sound level measurement at a set distance from the exhaust while the vehicle is operated at a certain RPM. Okay, typically it's 2 feet. You can have different distances be specified, and then they would need to meet a certain sound level requirement while the engine operates at a given RPM. So it requires someone to obviously press on the accelerator while the vehicle's running, raise the RPM to a certain level, and somebody takes a measurement at a set distance from the exhaust pipe, and it has to meet a certain sound level. So then the inspector would note the result in the software, and it would be a reject or a pass, right? So that's kind of how it would work. So you could see that could take, that would add some time to the inspection process, several steps, that kind of stuff. Yeah, and then there's some other recurring costs, and we will talk about costs in a minute. I have other slides on that. So that's sort of the inspection manual idea, right? Okay, let's change the inspection process. So those are kind of the possibilities there. And then you have some options in statute. So we could actually change the law to, to create a sound level limit and then ask law enforcement to enforce that law somehow, right? And there are obviously lots of different ways to do this. We talked about a couple. So if we start off with noise testing with using law enforcement as enforcement, so that would be creating an objective standard for sound. And we'll talk about that later. Typically, most states do a given sound level at a given speed at a given distance from the vehicle center line. So while the vehicle's in motion, some other states do a static test with the vehicle stopped. And again, sort of like the inspection process, the vehicle has to be operated at a certain RPM, and you measure at a certain distance from the exhaust while that's happening. So there are different ways to test, obviously, and there are challenges and benefits to both. But overall, the idea of this kind of testing is it implements an objective standard, right? This is a set level at a set distance under set conditions, and testing occurs on the vehicles as they're driven, which is very important, right? Nobody's going to be able to swap their muffler and avoid this test. It's going to happen in the field as vehicles go by, as they actually are while they're driving around. And also testing can be performed, and I didn't mention this, but obviously testing of a static vehicle is not going to detect vehicle noise from motion, such as engine compression braking noise, right? So engine braking noise is not going to be captured during an inspection because it only occurs while the vehicle's in motion and slowing down and using that engine compression brake. So testing in the field, one of the big benefits of it is it does capture that sound levels from vehicles in motion. Some of the challenges are, and these just can't be hand waved away, these are real challenges that would need to be addressed. It's often very difficult to test for sound at the side of the road while vehicles are in motion. And that's because sound level meters, by their very nature, they don't detect the source of the sound. They just detect the overall sound level at the microphone. So if there are multiple vehicles on the road, right, it may be obvious to us with our 2 ears and our human brain processing, hey, that's the loud vehicle. But for the sound level meter, it's just measuring the overall sound level. And so it's difficult in that situation with lots of motorcycles or lots of cars going by to say that one specifically was the loud one. Okay. Now, if it's an empty road and there's one vehicle that goes by, then testing's pretty straightforward. We have on here law enforcement must make a subjective determination of which cars to test. That sort of implies, some places, especially places with static testing, the officer actually pulls over, right, stops the vehicle, says, hey, that sounds like a loud vehicle, pulls the vehicle over, and then does testing on the exhaust, for instance, on the side of the road. So that there's some subjective nature to that. But obviously testing at the side of the road as vehicles go by, that doesn't apply. So we're talking, there are definitely a lot of options for how this testing is performed. And those are some of the benefits and some of the challenges. Obviously, we covered this already, right? That this is an additional thing that law enforcement would be asked to do. So that's just one of the challenges of it. So that's the idea of having law enforcement officers do testing. Are there any questions? We want to do any more discussion on that? Or we want to talk about it later? Or?
Why don't we move through this and
Okay. Yeah, I'll speed up a little bit. So sort of another option in statute would be the idea of using what we called an automated drive-by monitoring sound level meter or sound or acoustic camera system. So this is what I referenced earlier, sort of like a speed camera. You can imagine, rather than testing for speed, it tests for sound levels. There are existing systems like this. They're in use in some neighboring states. And essentially they combine either a sound level meter or an acoustic camera. So as I mentioned, the sound level meter is just a device that measures the sound level. It does not determine direction, does not determine the source of the sound. It just measures the sound level at the microphone from all sources. An acoustic camera is a relatively new technology that really the price is dropping significantly. The technology is really emerging. I think it's going to be kind of a game changer in terms of vehicle noise enforcement, to be honest. An acoustic camera deploys an array of microphones, so a bunch of microphones, sometimes as many as 64 or 128, a lot of microphones, but they're very small. And it puts all these microphones, and it actually can determine not just the sound level, but also where the sound is coming from. And actually can display that over a video or a still image of the situation, and it can determine, often with just astonishing accuracy, where the sound is coming from. So for instance, you can have a video image of cars or motorcycles going by, and it can, boom, it can highlight the exhaust on this motorcycle is the loud part, right? So that's what an acoustic camera does, how it works. You can imagine that's really important or a very helpful technology, especially for measuring on a busy road where there are lots of cars going by. So we envisioned here a static system. I mean, it can be on a trailer, so it can be moved around, but essentially it's fixed in a location while it's testing. And it has a license plate reader and either a sound level meter or an acoustic camera, and it measures the sound using one of those devices. And if the sound level limit is exceeded, then it can either flag the vehicle for further check, it can, issue a citation, whatever, right? There's lots of options after that. So this is a great technology, emerging technology. It implements an objective standard. There's no additional burden on law enforcement. That's extremely helpful. Again, it measures vehicles in motion as they are driven on the road. This is very helpful. This is very important. And it gets everything, right? It's measuring exhaust. It's measuring loud stereos. It's measuring engine braking. It's measuring squealing tires, right? All of those kind of things that happen in motion can be detected by these kind of systems. Some of the challenges to these, I think the biggest probably is that my understanding, I'm not a legislative expert, but my understanding from stakeholders is that right now there are some Vermont statutes that kind of make this very difficult to implement. So there probably would need to be some changes to the legislation to allow for this kind of unattended or remote enforcement. I understand that there's some investigation of this for speed cameras. So kind of you can imagine similar challenges for this as for speed cameras. There's a higher cost per station, right? These are pretty sophisticated. They have license plate readers, all that kind of stuff. So higher cost per location. And then there's some software stuff. And then of course, the last one, which shouldn't be ignored, is that there may be legal challenges to this, just like there are for speed cameras, right? So
what does higher cost mean?
Well, you know what? I'll touch on that in just a minute, if that's all right.
Okay.
So here we go. Item 2, cost to incorporate testing into the periodic inspection manual. So again, costs really depend on the type of noise testing inspection requirement. If we just change the manual, that's the first line. If we just update the legislation, make changes to the software, update and reissue the manual, and then we do a little bit of marketing, change the website to help train inspection mechanics on what might be needed, it's really very inexpensive. Right? We estimate something like $30,000, right, to make these changes, and they're one time, right? They're not annual recurring. So that's obviously very, very inexpensive. If we try and implement, noise testing as part of the VPIM, this is actually the most expensive option that we looked at using our assumptions, just because there are a lot of testing stations. So you're buying a lot of sound level meters. The changes to the software are more extensive. So, you know, even at $500 a sound level meter, there are a lot of inspection stations in Vermont. So we end up with more than $500,000 just buying sound level meters for everybody. Now that cost could be pushed onto the inspection stations. Stakeholders felt like there would be a lot of pushback if that was the case. So, you know, who bears this cost is obviously open for some determination, but that's kind of the general cost that would need to be borne on a one-time basis for that measurement at an inspection station. And then once you have a fleet of sound level meters, you have to maintain them, you have to calibrate them, they're going to break, they have to be replaced and fixed, they have a limited service life. So you have to figure there's going to be recurring costs in maintaining all those different sound level meters. Okay, and we said something like $100,000 or so to keep those going indefinitely. All right, so total here is somewhere in the 650,000 range for one-time implementation, and then annual recurring of about $100,000 or more. So costs for law enforcement training, that was the charge. We also talk about some other costs associated with, obviously, if we're going to have law enforcement do sound level testing, they're going to need sound level meters. So there's going to be costs again with those. And then training really depends on how many officers we're training. There are about 1,250 active officers in Vermont, somewhere around there. We figured if we train on the order of 250 a year, then every 5 years people would get trained again. So maybe a 5-year certification process for the sound level training. Obviously, not all officers need to be trained, and not all officers need a sound level meter. So these costs may be on the high side, could be lower if we had a subset, right? These are kind of our assumptions. Figure $500 a sound level meter, about $100 an hour to train an officer. That's admin time and lost labor time, that kind of stuff. So our one-time cost for this was something like, again, if we buy a sound level meter for every officer in Vermont, which may not be necessary, something like $250,000, that obviously can come down. You can do the math and think about how many officers really need sound level meters. And then something like $18,000 to develop the training. That's a short 1-hour online course on how to do the training, how to implement that kind of stuff. And then you'd have the annual recurring costs of maintaining that fleet of sound level meters, and then also, you know, recurring costs for training. So somewhere, and again, this is highly dependent on how many sound level meters we're buying, right? You could multiply 500 by the number of sound level meters to figure that out. Yeah, there you go. So that's the training cost, item 3. And then charge 4 was, what are some options to address excessive motor vehicle noise that do not involve noise testing? Okay, and we've touched on some of these already. Visual inspections, I think we've sort of already talked about that as part of the inspection procedure. You could also, you know, empower law enforcement to do visual inspections, but there's some challenges there. They were going to crawl underneath the vehicle. For motorcycles, it would be easier. You know, they could check for labeling, I guess, on the exhaust muffler. I don't know if you want to charge law enforcement with that or not, but that's a possibility. Product labeling. This is one place I think our report was a little deficient, and I apologize. We did not talk about current existing federal product labeling. You know, right now there are federal requirements for motorcycle mufflers that they have a mark on them, a sticker or an indication that they are suitable for use on the given motorcycle. Nothing like that exists for passenger vehicles, but it does exist right now at the federal level for motorcycles. Another thing we talk about in the report is essentially public education campaigns. This would be, you know, a wide variety of things here possible, right? Like talk about effects of noise, that would be, you know, disturbing the neighbors. You're literally, in many cases, you're threatening the, you know, as a driver of a loud vehicle, you're kind of, you know, bringing disrepute on your type. I don't know. You can imagine different kinds of public education campaigns, either around noise and long-term noise effects or other components. And then road signage. So road signage really is already in use, especially for engine compression braking, right? There are definitely cities and towns in Vermont that have signs that say things like, you know, no engine compression braking or no Jake brakes, that kind of stuff. And actually feedback from stakeholders was that that kind of stuff can be effective. So definitely that's something that could be considered. And then 5, approaches from other states. And I want to leave more time for questions, so I'm not going to go into this super detailed. A lot of states don't have a quantitative limit. So for instance, New Hampshire, Maine, as I mentioned, does allow for noise testing to be used as a defense should someone be served with a citation for excessive noise. So if they get served with a ticket, they can actually go to an inspection station in Maine. There are a few, only a few in Maine that have the sound level testing capabilities, and they can challenge that. It's an affirmative defense, and they can get that citation dismissed. So that's one possibility, but it does then require essentially a subjective determination by law enforcement that, hey, that's a loud vehicle, they should get a citation. But that's kind of how the system works there. A few other states have quantitative limits. I'll touch on those here. So typically, states that have quantitative limits, I've really focused on ones that have a limit on the moving sound levels because those are more prevalent. They always, and this is pretty important, they're always in A-weighted decibels. That's the unit. So they typically specify the A-weighted sound level in decibels at 50 feet from the vehicle's center line. Everybody's kind of agreed upon that, it seems like, as the distance. And it's not from the edge of the road, but it's from actually the vehicle's center line. So it's like the center of the lane that the vehicle's traveling in. Most states divide it into 2 categories, less than 10,000 pounds. For some reason, Pennsylvania uses 6,000, but sort of lightweight vehicles, so that's passenger cars, light trucks, and then heavier trucks have a different sound level limit, and then they typically divide it into speed less than or equal to 35 and speed greater than 35. And here's kind of your range. Connecticut and Pennsylvania, they have hard and soft test sites. So what they're talking about is the ground absorption. So hard would be concrete or asphalt between the measurement location and the center lane, the center of the vehicle lane. Soft ground being like grass or something like that. So they have different limits for hard or soft ground. You see here this select group. This is not every state that has one. I just grabbed states kind of in the eastern part of the United States. Rhode Island has a much higher limit because they have the same limit for trucks and cars. Everybody else has quite a bit lower limits for cars and trucks. Speed less than or equal to 35. You see it ranges from 70 to 78 from Ohio to Pennsylvania, and then from 79 to 84. So that's kind of the range for low speed versus high speed for varying states. Rhode Island, again, has the same. So if we go to trucks, so greater than 10,000 pounds or greater than 6,000 for Pennsylvania, Ohio doesn't have a distinct limit there, but everybody else pretty much has 86 to 88 for low speed and 90 to 92 for higher speeds. And then I did have a slide here about roadside sound level testing challenges, but I've really covered a lot of this stuff already. So I think I can take any questions anybody has. Hopefully that was helpful. And any questions about acoustics or technologies or anything like that, I'm happy to talk about that. There are some other slides in the presentation kind of near the end where I try and just covered some general acoustics topics.
I don't see any hands in the committee, but I think we have your contact information, and we may be back around and ask you some more questions.
Sure. No, that'd be great. That would be great.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.
And is Wade here?
I am.
And I would say we're getting awfully close to lunch, so we may have to have, some of you back.
I'll make mine quick. I'm Wade Cochran, Director of Enforcement and Safety, and I brought two of my team members here that could probably answer a lot of your questions. I was given the noise study last year by the former commissioner. And just to clarify one question, we were all for the noise study. We did not have a pro or con. We wanted to see what the noise study would come up with. Some of the concerns that I have heard through law enforcement, and through some of our repairs.
And our question is, we have Bill directly in front of us, and we're gonna want you to comment on that bill specifically
Correct.
and the pieces of that.
Correct. So we 100% stand behind the noise study and the findings. With the bill, some of the concerns are the cost implication on some of our shops, some of the law enforcement. Though it might not seem like a high ticket on the slide that we just saw, some small agencies don't have that amount of money to be able to put in to the noise testing equipment. Some of the shops have expressed that same concern. And that the price that they would have to, or the money that they would put into this would ultimately have to go to Vermonters to make up that difference. Which I know in other committee, there's concern about the inspection. The other thing on the bill would be a lot of towns now have, some of the towns mentioned have noise ordinances already in place. And I can speak that I used to work for a small agency and I don't ever remember writing one. So maybe that's something we could touch upon too. So any questions? And then I can also have my team.
So the costs we got were kind of high level. The IT system would have to be upgraded to include this, and it would be helpful if you could put together something that, and there's different levels of quality of equipment that we've talked about in here. So, as someone that doesn't really do this or understand this, we're going to need some help understanding exactly what we're talking about here, what might be mandated for equipment and what all of that looks like. So, I would ask that, you give us a markup and kind of show us what this might mean to a shop.
Sure, and I can get those figures for you, sir. I don't have those, obviously.
And if we could get some explanation and more detail to understand what the difference is in the type of equipment as we look at this.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ian.
And I wondered about the visual inspection part. So we heard testimony this morning from Kenworth dealer that just said that if he's inspecting a tractor trailer for truck for the main system and it has a straight pipe, he has to deny it. But if it's Vermont, he approves it. So for that kind of change to the manual, I would be interested what you feel like. There's probably the bill talked about the decibel benefit, but if there was just the visual part where if there isn't a muffler or if it's obviously a straight pipe, it's rejected.
Well, I think there's
If we could also have that, just have the department's position on that.
Sure.
Second part.
Well, for me, it came a breakup. In our hearings this morning, the particular complaints that we heard the most about were trucks.
Correct.
And the inspections for trucks is different than it is for a pleasure vehicle, and the requirements around that. I want to better understand what the inspection manual says for a truck versus a pleasure vehicle that you might be pulling in a small shop in a community. I don't expect a lot of the I can only think of in my area, one place that really works on tractor trailer trucks. And my town has like 5 small shops that do inspections. So there's a difference between each of those levels.
There is, and I have my 2 guys here that could answer that. If you.
Well, and
So,
my only question really is in that, how long is that gonna take? Because we've got 9 minutes. And, but, and I wanna highlight what the questions are around that, so as you, so you guys could think about this and come back to us to better explain what.
we can't do it in 9 minutes,
No, I didn't think you could.
so.
But I think the equipment, I think clearly the questions that the senator from Washington has raised about, but his seem to me be particularly about trucks and highlight what the differences in the manual between trucks and pleasure vehicles would be.
We can do that.
And if there's any, if there would be a cost or a problem
Okay.
with the department for making those changes.
Sure.
Yeah, at both levels, both the pleasure vehicle and the truck level.
We can do that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't know I came late to the party. So is your question to distinguish between especially the cost for doing this for trucks versus doing it for pleasure?
Not the decibel reading, I understand that, but if you were to just do something on a visual inspection, like the muffler isn't there, or the muffler is obviously.
Okay.
Doesn't have the pass, or something like that, where they're already inspecting the muffler, could we add something just to make those vehicles not pass inspection that are passing inspection?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. And then I would just be interested, these cost estimates, I think, are for pleasure vehicles and trucks.
I would have to verify that, and I don't know if they're still on. I believe it's just pleasure car in this.
Oh, so
Right.
the issue is trucks, right? Or
Well, we
it
heard,
seems to
we
be,
heard more this
Yeah.
morning. Isn't that
Yeah,
from what you,
majority of
what
it.
my ears heard?
Yeah.
But I would like to, what did you hear? Go.
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the complaints, the majority of the discussion focused around truck noise.
and big trucks.
Big
Yeah.
rates.
About brakes.
Yeah.
So I don't know how big of a deal it would be to modify the
I can ask.
cost if we focus on
And it
commercial trucks. basically.
is there, you're going to show my total ignorance here. I have one shop that in my whole area that really does tractor trailer trucks. What's the difference between, is there any licensing difference or anything? What's the difference in the two
Okay.
between pleasure and that, for the department?
Lieutenant, can you answer that?
Sure. A lot of the heavy trucks are designated as fleet inspection stations because they own their own trucks. And they're not required to have lifts because a lift to hoist a truck of that size is very, very expensive. So they have jack stands typically that, have to be capable of hoisting that vehicle up in the air so they can do a proper and thorough inspection. But there's definitely differences with what's in the manual for cars, motorcycles, and heavy trucks. There are not a lot of public stations that are certified heavy truck, but if you were to get that designation, potentially if you go on to the automated vehicle inspection program, you can put up, inspection stations within, 25-mile radius, for instance, and it'll pull up exactly who's around that can do that type of truck. But most heavy trucks are owned by a specific business who are already designated as a fleet station for the most part.
So, I mean, just to clarify, if I get certified at my local, gas station to inspect cars, I'm not certified to inspect a large truck.
Correct.
So if we made,
Unless you wanted, like you'd have to,
Better
meet certain requirements
further schooling or whatever, training.
in certain space.
we need you to, give us your name.
Oh, I'm sorry.
For the record in this,
My name's Daniel Merchant.
okay,
It's MERCHAND, and I'm a lieutenant with DMV Enforcement and Safety Investigations Division.
thank you.
You're very
That's just for the record.
No problem. I'm sorry. First time doing this.
So it would, we could, if we chose to in here, treat inspection for big trucks separately from the pleasure cars.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Good. I mean, that would make sense to me. And I have a bunch of truck, operators in my district, so I'm gonna make sure they know, or at least a couple of them know, and then they can talk to each other.
Sure.
I think you're coming back.
Hey.
And you'll be hearing from Megan, but you get an idea of where our questions are coming from and around to understand that. And we'll make more time for you in this process, so,
Sounds good.
okay. And we are at, and I suspect you have meetings. And you probably do too.
This afternoon.